Okay, hello everyone. So, to make sure we don't run behind schedule, I will kick off now. I know there are plenty more people joining the call right now. However, I've just got a very brief introduction before I hand over to Sarah. So, first off, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I do hope you enjoy both this session and the other two sessions of the AI and Digital Innovation Upskilling course run by the Change Agents team here. This trio I'm going to introduce in a moment. Essentially, so when it comes to AI and digital innovation, there's so much here and it's evolving so rapidly and it affects every aspect of our society and beyond. I am in no way a technical expert. My role here is to convene and hold the space. However, this is for our student team to do. They are amazing. And they've gone across the university and pulled together our academic expertise from various corners across the university. What we can cover within an hour and a half is, as you can probably tell, only the very tip of an iceberg of the discussions that we can go into here. However, this can be just the beginning. So, without further ado, one bit of admin quickly. The call will be recorded. So please do let us know if that's all right. And I don't think I missed anything out. So I'll hand over to Sarah now. And first of all, let's start off with some digital applause for our Change Agents team, who are doing a wonderful job and have brought you all here today. Okay, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Amber. So this project will be focusing on everything AI upskilling and innovation. So our main objective and aim here today is to focus on developing these digitally innovative skills through upskilling you guys and giving you the opportunity to develop those skills as well.
So, hi everyone. This is our team. My name is Fatu, and I'm the CEO of this course, and we've been working as a team together. Just a little bit about me. I'm also the president of the Afro-Caribbean Society here at the University of Exeter. I'm also an entrepreneur and an economics student as well.
Hi everyone, I am Lorenzo. Some of you may know me from Export or Entrepreneurs or Engineering, which is what I study. I'm the CTO for this project, so think all about the bit bringing and reviewing the knowledge to make sure we're on track regarding the trends and a bit what's out there in AI. Also, on top of this project, I also have an AI agents company, which will also talk about the agents in the next session and other related things. I'm really excited for this session.
As you've already heard from me, I'm Sarah. I've been kind of helping out with the operational side of this project, and I am a medical imaging student. So in terms of the curriculum over this course over the next week and a half, we've got this panel session today where we'll be kind of looking at all things the theory of AI and using that to kind of develop a resilient mindset, especially in an ever-changing world. This will kind of be structured as we're having our introduction now, and then we'll be handing over to our panelists for a quick introduction from them. and we will have a Q&A session at the end as well. Week 2 we'll be looking at all things digital innovation, so this will include prompt engineering, looking at agents and things like that, and week 3 we'll be looking at AI and academics as well as employability.
So just to start us off, we've received a few questions about the platform and the emails that you've gotten. So I'm just going to quickly run through the platform, how to access it, how it works, and answer all of your questions. So by now you should have received 2 emails from our team, and the second one should have included your personal ID. So I'm just going to show you and take you through the steps of how to log into your account and everything that's needed. And if you have any questions or any queries, you can just reply to that email and somebody from our team will respond to you. So let me quickly just start sharing my screen. So here you can see this is how the email would look like that you would have received. So here you can see there's your personal ID, this code right here. And here is your personal link that you click to access, and it shouldn't be shared with anyone because this is how you'll be able to get your certificate and everything. So once you click on this link right here, it should take you to this page. So here is where you would just go and copy your personal ID and then put it into the code, and it should take you here. So then when you get here, it's very important that you enter your full name because as it says here, this will be the name that is printed on your certificate. If you've already logged into your account and maybe didn't put your full name or put a different name and you'd like to change it, you can just reply to that specific email and we can get it sorted for you. So here I'm just going to put in my full name and I'm going to save it. So this is how the platform looks. As you can see, it's a very simple one-page platform. So here is where you would click to join all of the meetings, our Teams meetings. You would click this link and you would be able to join. Here's all of your information. Here you can click this to contact us. Here you can click this to go to our website where you can find out some more information. Here you can click it to log out. So here you can find all of the materials that you'll need, additional materials, and the slide deck that we are going to be presenting today, or any materials that we present that you'd like to keep. And then here, very important, is where you put in your check-in code. So at the end of the session, we're going to give you a check-in code, and you need to attend 2 out of 3 of the sessions that we are having in order to receive your certificate. So you just put in the check-in code, and then it should take you to a quick little feedback form. Here you can slide the dial to rate the session and to answer the questions, and then you can leave your feedback here when you're done, and then you're all checked in. So it's a relatively easy website to figure out, but if you have any questions or any queries, like we said, you can just reply to the email that you received and we should get back to you. Yeah, that's about it. And if you have any questions right now, you can just put it in the chat and we'll be able to answer them for you. And yeah, I'll just hand over back to Sarah to start the session.
Thank you, Fatu. So next we'll be kind of looking at the general vocabulary that will be recurring through this panel that will be helpful for you to understand. So we'll start with the fact that an algorithm is a set of rules to complete a task or solve a problem. AI uses complex algorithms and they're first trained to a data set. So for example, ChatGPT would have interpreted the entire internet. From this training, a model is generated, and from its training, it's also able to formulate and identify different patterns. Generative AI is one of those models that can create meaningful information that produces items in response to the input that you will put in. A large language model, or an LLM, is a specific type of generative AI that can generate interpretable text. We have some further key vocab that also has to be explained for this session. On to the next slide. So AI models are so mathematically complex in general that it's difficult to see their processes and how they work. And so XAI is a field of understanding these more internal processes. Generative AI can generate information, but also hallucinate and produce a false output. And so even beyond this, there is a problem of bias where algorithms will produce results that unfairly favor certain groups, and this can exacerbate different inequalities. As such, human-in-the-loop systems can be a solution to this. Here, a human can look at how the AI is trained and how it works to reduce these effects. This also kind of circles back to the usefulness of XAI as a whole. We've got two more definitions left now. So the field of computational ethics is a study of computers' abilities to learn tasks that mirror the cognitive processes of humans. And then finally, we have AGI and ASI. AGI is where a machine achieves human intelligence levels in all fields, and then an ASI is where superhuman intelligence levels are achieved in all fields. So the main idea overall here is that we can just provide you with some preliminary context, but don't worry if you don't remember all of this. This will kind of be reintroduced throughout the panel as we kind of have these conversations. We've got a reflection question on the slide over here. This will kind of show up now and after the panel as well to see if kind of there's been any evolution in your thought processes and ideas. And that will also lead us well onto the Q&A where we can hear your thoughts and directly answer any questions that you guys have. So this is the panel discussion today. You, me, and AI will be looking at developing a resilient mindset for an ever-changing world in the context of AI. Here are the topics that we'll be looking at. So we'll be looking at AI de-skilling, reliance, and its overall societal impact, XAI, AI and bias, and the trust and literacy aspects, AI and moral agency, computational ethics, and human and AI collaboration. And then we'll be closing off by looking at the future of AI and human collaboration. This is our lovely panel. So I will just start by giving off a brief introduction and then hand over to them. So firstly, we have Tyler Brunet, who is from the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Philosophy and Anthropology, and his research is within the intersection of AI and philosophy, among many other areas. We also have Olivia Hill-Cousins, who is a PhD student from the Faculty of Health and Sciences, Life Sciences, and her research is in the intersection of cognitive psychology and AI. And finally, we have David Walker, who is from the computer science faculty, and his research looks at evolutionary computation, AI, and many other areas as well. These are all academics from our university network, and so I will hand over to them and they can tell us more about their backgrounds and their field of expertise in relation to the world of AI. If we can start with you, Tyler, if that's okay.
Just a bit about my background. Right. So I'm a philosopher of science. I have a bit of a background in computer science. I did a master's in computational biology, but it's been quite a long time. So I haven't been writing computer programs for a while. But in my PhD, I got interested in the philosophy of technology in general and how it related to the philosophy of biology, since I'd mostly been trained in the philosophy of biology. And that's what led me to start to do some research on the philosophy of artificial intelligence, in particular the philosophy of explainable artificial intelligence. I've been doing a bit of research lately on issues surrounding the ethics of AI, but mostly a focus on ontological issues around AI. What is it? How should we think about it? What are its impacts?
Thank you. I will hand over to you, David.
Sorry. Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm David Walker, and I'm a computer scientist and have been working in areas related to AI and understanding AI for about 15 years now. And basically, what I aim to do is produce methods that a person can use to understand what the AI tool is doing. So AI is often a black box. It's often, sort of a function machine that we put stuff into, we put some data in, we turn a handle and outcomes of prediction. What happens in the middle can be a mystery. And if it remains a mystery, then there are implications for how much people trust what's going on, how likely they are to use it, and we want people to use the technology that we're working on because that's part of the reason we do it. Also interested in techniques for involving humans in AI processes, so human in the loop. AI is where you have an AI tool, but also, as we heard just now, you have a human decision maker steering that process. So you often end up with better results, more actionable results. That's me.
And over to you, Olivia.
Hello. Yeah, so as outlined by Sarah, my name's Olivia. I'm doing a PhD currently in moral cognition and looking at its application to AI. So for my undergraduate degree, I was applying that more to psychopathy. So quite a different application now. But along with that, kind of working within a more interdisciplinary area called computational ethics, which Sarah outlined before. Which essentially was actually developed by one of my supervisors, Eddie Awood, who works in the university as well. And just basically, like from a computer science perspective, outlines the potential to hopefully make AI more ethical by trying to like mirror something in human moral cognition. So basically how we as humans process morality and trying to look at that as a potential framework to make it ethical. So that's essentially my area and where I stemmed from. Obviously not as been in it as long as the other guys, so very much new to the field, but yeah, hopefully still make some interesting contributions.
Thank you very much. So we'll start with some quick fire questions to each panelist, and then we'll open up the conversation a bit more broadly. And so we'll start with you, Tyler. The first question is, can a society remain authentically human if most of its thinking is altered or replaced by artificial intelligence or AI?
Yeah, just a really quick question, right? So I suppose there's two big parts of it. I suppose if I have to answer it yes or no, I would just say no. No, it can't. But I think that's because I think there's something involved in human authenticity about doing things for yourself and acquiring skills yourself. So I think that if the latter part of the question was really satisfied, that most or very many of the things that human beings were doing that were part of their good lives or their authentic selves were offloaded to AI, I think that would be a serious impediment for people to be able to live the kind of authentic lives that they were living before.
And should we accept that some knowledge and skills will be obsolete as a result of AI?
Yeah, that's probably a yes, but with the qualifier some. Every technology is such that it makes certain forms of skill obsolete. The printing press made manual copying of Latin manuscripts obsolete. The inkjet printer made using printing press dials obsolete. And so there's always going to be some loss of certain skills with the introduction of the new technology. But the sort of more qualified version of that is what we need to make sure we're doing is not losing skills that we really want to have, that we think are valuable. Perhaps copying Latin manuscripts is enjoyable for some people, but it might not be part of the good life, right? But some of the things that AI is replacing that we're doing might actually be part of the good life.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, is there something fundamentally valuable about human struggle and effort that we lose when AI makes something seamless or effortless?
Right. Again, I want to give a qualified answer. I mean, in cases like the production of works of art or the production of a manifesto or the production of one's ideas, I think, yeah, people notoriously believe that part of the strife or struggle associated with those tasks creates value, at least for the maker, if not for the person who consumes those sorts of things. But then other tasks are just the sorts of things that are drudgery, and it would be nice to do away with them. Bertrand Russell wrote an excellent essay called In Praise of Idleness, where he points out that with the introduction of a new technology, often what we do is we deprive people of work that they could have had. And if we're doing that right, we're depriving people of work that we shouldn't have been forcing upon them in the first place. But if we're doing it wrong, then we're taking away work that's valuable.
Thank you. We'll move on to David. So your first question is, should we sacrifice AI performance for better explainability in critical scenarios, for example, healthcare?
I think I'll give a qualified answer as well. I would say no is the literal answer. In the case of healthcare, you are dealing literally with people's lives, and accuracy is vitally important. You can't have, an approximate AI tool that's performing neurosurgery. It needs to be right. I think that said, it is important to have explainability. So if there's a choice between two equally accurate tools, one is highly explainable, one is not, then I would go for the one that is, because I think the more explainability, the more someone is able to understand what's going on, the better they'll be able to use and benefit from the tool. But yeah, there are cases where you can't sacrifice. Actually, there are also cases where you can. If it's designing your route around the shop, the supermarket or something, you can live with a little bit of a loss of accuracy, in favour of something a bit more explainable. But if it's mission critical, then you need the accuracy.
Definitely. And will human in the loop systems become redundant as AI gets more advanced?
I don't think they will. I think as society changes and as new things are subjected to AI, and we try to do new things with it, there are always going to be ways that humans can inform what it's doing, and I think that I don't see that going away. I think perhaps if we were to get to an AGI scenario or an ASI scenario, then you might find potentially it would be more open for discussion. But I think at the moment we're a long way away from that, and I don't see that as being we're not going to get there anytime soon. So I would say no.
Finally, should AI systems be required to show their evaluation metrics, such as quote unquote confidence levels, to users, even if most people won't understand them?
I think yes. I think people should be able to question AI tools. I think that part of understanding them is exposing ourselves to the confidence. If someone looks at a weather forecast, they'll look at a confidence interval. I think I think people's aptitude for understanding things like confidence intervals is underrated, and I think if you present it in the right way, I think it's actually quite an accessible thing. If someone says, how likely is it to rain tomorrow, that's asking for a confidence interval in a prediction. So I think it's quite reasonable to expect it.
Thank you. And we'll be over to you, Olivia. Your first question is, should users be legally responsible for harmful content created by AI, even if it was without malicious intent?
So my answer to that is yes, but I guess I will give a bit more of an explanation as well. So that's the trend so far. I think yes, because I think when you use any other kind of tool, the person themselves has a responsibility basically to check that and check the output. But I also think intent is a very important thing within the model that I look at to understand human moral cognition. And I think even if not necessarily malicious intent, but intent in the sense of, am I publishing this, knowing that this harmful content is there? Am I publishing it, purposefully to cause some kind of harm to someone else? Like those two kind of purposefully and knowingly being two kind of different factors of intent. And I think that's what's kind of critical to think about as well. Is like when you're producing that output, you hopefully have read it or something, and then therefore like you're knowingly producing, like putting that information out there. So I think, yeah, there's definitely responsibility at every level when you use a tool, but particularly with this one because we're aware of the harms as well.
Definitely. And is it ethical to use AI to reduce human cognitive biases, even if people don't consent to being corrected?
Yeah, so I think yes to this one as well. And I think it would potentially be quite controversial, but in my mind, how we would use it to address the issues of biases are particularly in places where we have the issue of implicit biases. So this is like, racial, gender biases are essentially outside of our conscious awareness. So we don't necessarily have as much control over the effect of those. And if we're able to, if we think about healthcare, for example, if the way that racial biases and gender biases impact those fields already, if we had an AI system that was actually able to reduce those biases, then I think if we just assume that it was great in all other circumstances, then I think that should kind of override the person as like a healthcare professional's like kind of preference as to whether it's used or not, because I think in that kind of case, it's never really going to serve its purpose if we have a person that's kind of saying yes, this is okay. Like I completely agree that this should be used, or saying that it's not okay to be used. And I think like something we chatted about a bit before as well, especially in cases with like racial biases and gender biases. I think once if we go back to like explainable AI, like David was talking about, if how it got to that decision is actually demonstrated to healthcare professionals, then I think most people would be like, okay, yeah, all right, valid. If it's able to demonstrate that it didn't come to that conclusion for any reason other than, or they didn't come to that for any reason other than some kind of bias. So I think in that sense, it would kind of negate the number of people that wouldn't agree. But yeah, I think my main answer is that in critical situations, it would override that kind of right anyway.
And lastly, can AI systems ever truly understand human morality, or will they only simulate it?
So I think only simulate in this case. I think it can get to an extent where it has, so that's kind of the goal of computational ethics as well, is to get it to a point where it has like what looks like human morality kind of coded into it in depth. I'm not going to go into any details because my understanding of the technology is minimal. But in that sense, it would be kind of simulating something like human morality, but not necessarily what we consider it to be. And I just say that in terms of what we think it is, more like when we're having more like kind of conscious discussions about it. People factor in emotion and empathy and all of these kind of characteristics when we think about anything to do with like morality and ethics. And I think therefore, like for a lot of people, those factors would be so critical that it would be hard to ever kind of say that AI is therefore capable of doing morality in that sense.
Thank you. And now we're going to open up some questions to the broader panel overall. So we'll start with thinking about how can we upskill the public in AI, and how do we create algorithms that the public can trust and understand?
I can go first. So I think with this idea of trust and everything as well, it's very much the kind of aim with computational ethics, with making it explainable, making it transparent, so people are more aware of how it works. And I think what's really important about teaching how AI in general works, if we just think about like even with this course, like I know you guys are teaching prompt engineering in the next session, having those kind of skills help you to, and especially like an understanding of how it works, I think makes you realize how much you can kind of rely on the answers, but I think also like the level of trust, because I think we discuss a lot about increasing people's trust, but the flip side of that is also having an AI model that actually perhaps isn't very accurate isn't very, good in any of the kind of realms, but then we have people that trust it too much because of this kind of generic approach to just kind of saying, oh, AI is not that bad, whatever the approach might be. So I think once people have that understanding, I think what's crucial is that we're contributing to like critical thinking, and therefore taking each use of AI on its own really, and thinking, okay, do I trust this output? And then as like David was saying as well, like being able to look at the, like confidence intervals of that information, making a judgment for yourself. And I think in a way, I think that kind of taps into some of the other thoughts about AI making some skills redundant, because I think in many ways that is a harder skill than, than what the current situation is. So being able to look at the output and use that critical thinking is quite challenging, I think.
Yeah.
I think I can pick up there a bit. I think to give a direct answer to the question, how do you upskill the public in the use of AI, you can just look to other technologies where there's been a drive to increase public competence with the technology. Typing technology is a good one as an example. When it became possible, typing started to be taught in schools, and when it wasn't taught in schools, you could take extra programs as a typist to learn how to use typing technology and to get some familiarity with digitally entering data. Right. So that's a thing that people did. It entered the public school system, and just further engagement with the technology generates further familiarity with the capacities of the technology. And that's probably enough to increase public skill associated with the technology, right? But then the point that I feel like I have to mention is that whenever you do that, you also result in forms of de-skilling, right? So instead of spending public school time learning how to handwrite or learning how to modify documents on paper, if you spend that time learning how to type and to modify documents using a word processor, then you tend to lose the skills that are associated with handwriting and editing on paper. So I think the more complex question is not how we should upskill the public, but how we can upskill the public without also de-skilling them in relevant areas for their life.
Definitely. What do you guys perceive to be the importance of having transparent models and models that people kind of understand the processes within as well?
Start with that. I think that it's crucial. I think if you are a patient in a hospital and the doctor, announces I'm going to do this. So the example that I used when we talked the other day is amputation. I need to amputate your arm. I think it's quite reasonable that you say why, or are you sure? There are some really big names in the AI field who historically have not had this opinion, so they will rely on the public's trust of the training that a doctor goes to, and they've been at medical school for years. They've gone through these exams. They've done many exams. They've learned about when an arm can stay on and when it can't, and we therefore trust that they've gone through this education and they know what they're talking about. I think there are two things I disagree with there. First of all, I think I would still ask, are you absolutely certain that we can't do something else? Is there another option that we aren't talking about? And I think the other thing is people get medical training. They understand you go to a medical school, you do exams. They've done maybe something like it themselves in another area. Whereas if you talk about training, for example, a deep neural network, then people don't generally understand what that means. And they don't have that context to say, okay, I get that the algorithms trained the neural network and it's done its thing and out has popped this model that now predicts accurately. They don't have that way of relating to that. So unless you can say, here is why the model thinks this is the case, here's why you've got to have this procedure, here's why you've been rejected for this mortgage, here's why whatever it is that's been predicted about you and is affecting your life, I don't think that people can across the board be expected to pick up these tools and use them. I think it's essential. I don't think it's a uniform problem. I think there are people who will quite happily do what AI tells them to do, and I suspect, although I'm way outside of my own area here, but I suspect that as we move on through time and generations, my kids will not know a time without AI, which is a horrifying thought now I think of it, and they'll just accept it. They'll just go along with what it is. Whereas people who are my age, who remember, phones with spinny dials and telephone boxes and postage stamps and things, will always have a bit more of a critical eye on something like that. So yeah, I think it's really important.
And extending from this point of kind of transparency, as AI capabilities evolve beyond human limits, will explainability be our only path for trust? Should we sacrifice kind of understanding for its capability? You mentioned earlier the whole ASI or AGIs, and should we sacrifice their capability for our understanding?
So I haven't looked at explaining ASI, but I will have a go at a hypothesis, and I will hypothesize that will be much harder to explain because we don't have the context. If we're talking about AGI and we're talking about building a machine that is human competitive and does the things that we do and reasons and searches and solves problems and produces art, produces music, whatever it is we're comparing, then we know what good looks like there. We know how, we know what us doing it looks like. So we have some context. If we're talking about superhuman capabilities, it may not be as straightforward to explain. But I think the answer stands. I still think we need to have some way of watching what it's doing almost, and having some sort of point where we can say, no, what it's doing is not okay. The point of bias was mentioned earlier, being able to catch, no, this is behaving in a biased way, or it's behaving in an unsafe way. And I think whatever the level of intelligence that it's exhibiting is, we need to be able to see what it's doing. I'm going to stop talking because Tyler has his hand up.
I actually wanted to try to answer the previous question for a second, if I could, or give some kind of context to it. So I think the question as posed is difficult to answer because it assumes two things: that there's a sort of homogeneous public in terms of what the public can understand, and then there's a certain homogeneous set of risks or set of needs associated with gaining understanding in the case of AI systems. And just neither of those things are true. The public is not homogeneous in terms of what it can understand. Different groups of people with different amounts of training have different ability to understand different things at different times, right? So there are things that I can understand that a mechanic might say to me that I couldn't understand if someone who works on medical imaging might be able to explain to me. I might not be able to understand how radiation is produced in the machine, but I might be able to understand something about where tissues are located in my body, right? So because there's just different groups, we always kind of have to index our claims about our transparency or the explainability or the understandability, et cetera, to what's expectable from that group. And so a given patient, for instance, in a hospital setting who wants to know why an AI system has recommended some kind of potentially dangerous procedure to them, if we're thinking in that context, the ideal situation is that we can answer their why question with some kind of detailed description of the workings of the machine or something like that. But I think the fact we have to face is that most often we can't do that. And since we can't do that, we have to think differently about what our obligations are when people can't understand things, when someone's not in the right sort of group to be able to have understanding of some kind of judgment that's being made about them. And that's just to make things complicated and worse. Sorry, it doesn't really answer the question, but.
Yeah, if there's time, I was just going to extend off, well, both of your points now, actually, because David was talking a bit about bias and Tyler was making the point about being part of a group and whether you actually have the understanding to kind of say whether it is capable in that sense or not. And that was kind of how I would answer the questions, like drawing those kind of 2 points together. I think having an AI model that is, like more capable in some way will, especially if it's at a cost to explainability, I think will always harm the minority groups over and above the majority. And I think that's where the biggest problem is, especially because like when you look at like the biggest voices and in terms of AI, like we naturally, because we're able to be here and able to have these conversations, we come with like a wealth of privileges. And that does make us, less capable to actually have like a fully diverse, open-minded kind of conversation about these things. And I think it's at this point as kind of scary to think about a point where we could have, I mean, we already do use models that lack that explainability and are predominantly targeting those marginalized groups that already are being impacted, but then kind of tenfold because now we're using a system that, we have less kind of access to or less ability to stop. We just kind of have to accept, as David was saying, like in the future potential of just accepting its utility. So yeah, I think that like overall my biggest concern is how it impacts the marginalized groups that are already being impacted, because like the algorithm itself we were talking about earlier, like that itself has a bias, the data it's trained on at every level, and that's predominantly biased again towards the majority group. So I think it's concerning to think of like basically desiring that capability more so than the welfare of those groups.
Yeah. And if we're circling back to kind of the mentioning of bias and kind of misinformation, does the design of chat models, for example, where only the output is shown and not the decision-making process as a whole, make us vulnerable to misinformation? And if it does it make us also vulnerable as a result to model manipulation?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think even on the side of, I part of my PhD work, I also do some teaching roles, and I've marked so many papers now where it's very clear that they've used AI, and you can see them. Likewise, I'm not in any way, kind of berating students here, because I think we're all like kind of victim to it. But you can see where they've kind of fallen for this misinformation and not like recognize the need to kind of check that. And I think we had a chat about this before, but like even when you think about, like you were saying at the very start of this session, about how ChatGPT takes its information from the internet, it feels natural to kind of assume that that's going to be like good information. And also when you think about with humans, we kind of expect humans to be somewhat truthful rather than just standing there and making up a load of information. And I obviously there are people that do that, but we have this kind of mutual understanding that those kind of people aren't that great. We don't really want to be around them. So to then make an assumption that AI would do that, we're just not going to do that, because we recognize that's a bad quality. So why would we expect something that's meant to be so advanced to do that? And I think that's kind of where the problem lies, is again, like back to that kind of understanding of how AI works, that it does just kind of seem like a piece of technology that shouldn't do that. And it just takes that, again, that critical thinking to just kind of look at it and think, okay, maybe this isn't so great.
I think just
I kind of want. Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
I kind of want to give a similar. I mean, I kind of want to pull a similar line out of that one. So when you said, does it make us more vulnerable to manipulation or to deception? I think it highly depends on who's in question and who is using that information and what pre-existing training they have. So for somebody like me, if I were to be able to look under the hood of what's going on when chat gives me some answer, perhaps some problematic answer, all I'd see is vectors being multiplied by other vectors and a bunch of linear algebra and a hierarchy of code. That's what I'd actually see if I was given access to those things. And just like I can't tell the difference between a 150-sided figure and a 2,000-sided figure at a glance when it's on a piece of paper, I couldn't tell the difference between whether or not that machine is deceiving me in some way or not deceiving me in some way. So without some additional method just being able to look under the hood isn't generally going to provide anyone with very much information about whether or not they're being deceived.
I think there's a, and I completely agree with that, said the explainability person. But I think there's a sort of a higher level. We need to train ourselves to think critically around everything. I think, there's an AI problem here, but there's also, a social media problem. There's a conventional media problem is becoming bigger and bigger, I think. I think if we're going to focus on AI, which we should do, people need to think when they're using AI, when they're using ChatGPT or whatever they're using. And I'm stealing this from someone from about early 2023, late 2022 when it first came out. Is this an important task? And if it's an important task, if it's not an important task, then it doesn't matter if you use it or not, because if it gets it wrong, it's not going to matter. If you use it to plan a menu for something, as long as you don't have allergies and things, then, people will just eat the food and that'll be that. Is it an important task, and are you prepared to check it in detail? And if you are, then I think it's probably, again, fine to use it, and people should do so. And as long as they're checking that the task they've given it is producing, is resulting in a good output, then again, probably fine. If it's an important task and you're not prepared to put the time into thinking about it and to critically analyzing what it's giving you and to checking your sources and things, then I think you shouldn't use it. And I don't think you need any explainability built into that. I don't think it needs to be a transparent model to think this is too important for me to risk this. And I think it's not just an AI tool. I mean, people have, when they buy things, shops they won't buy things from because it's I don't trust that shop to give me a quality product. They have people when they're working with them that they think, I can't ask so and so to do it because I need the job done. Well, I'll ask this other person. I think it's a general thing that actually humans are quite good at, but we need to train ourselves to do it here for AI. So I don't think that I think interpretability is very important, but I don't think it's the silver bullet for solving this problem particularly.
And as we kind of bring up this point of critical thinking, how does our perception of AI as kind of omniscient or all-knowing affect how we kind of judge or use it?
Yeah, I think that kind of brings together what I was kind of implying with my answer to the question. I think that's probably one of the biggest contributors to that is this assumption that actually what I was talking about earlier with the flip side of the coin with increasing trust is that you increase the trust too much and then you like become over reliant on the model. And that does seem to be that, especially with the kind of the research I've been looking at as well, it does kind of seem to be the problem where you have people that seem to think that they'll use words like objective, factual, very accurate to describe the AI model, and you see that being translated also into how they then trust the model, how they use the model. Like they'll use it more than other people. They won't check it as often, things like that. And I think that's why these questions are so important. And actually, as David was saying about this being important also for social media, I think this has been something that we've needed to do for a while. Critical thinking has always been a very important skill. And I think AI has just basically made it, people have always had that apprehension around AI because, I mean, we have films like The Matrix, Terminator, so everyone's terrified of like robots and stuff. And I think it's just basically pushed past the threshold enough where people are scared enough to then think, okay, maybe this is actually necessary. And I think the harm was still there with social media, 100%, but it felt less salient than it does now.
Yeah, I think I don't want to bring too much philosophy into this, but I mean, maybe some philosophy is a little bit helpful. There's sort of two senses in which you might trust something or consider something to be trustworthy. Like when you have two cars that you could take to drive down the street and one of them tends to brake on you, you say, oh, I don't really trust that one today, I'm going to take the other one. Right. And so sometimes trust is just a proxy for reliability. And I think that's important in this context because one of the sort of going theories about what a good kind of criterion of whether you know something is whether it's produced by a reliable producer of knowledge, right? Some people and some things reliably tend to produce knowledge about some things and some don't. And so I think we're kind of at risk of conflating sort of something being very reliable with whether or not we should trust what its outputs are. There's a kind of common sense of trust that applies to people and maybe whether or not their actions will be nefarious. That isn't quite just whether or not they're reliable. So it's important to distinguish between those two things as well.
And extending further on this point of critical thinking, for students that are still developing these skills, does AI reliance represent a shortcut that can kind of stunt intellectual growth? Or do you think it can act as a tool that can accelerate and amplify their learning abilities? And to kind of extend off that again, it's a bit of a loaded question. As students, how can we kind of learn the difference and use it to inform our AI usage to be optimal?
I think I can comment on that briefly. I think there's just potentially like a difference in how you use it as you're still building those skills. So I think AI is really helpful with learning information. And, you know, I myself will use it if I'm struggling to understand a topic or something. And I think the difference in how you use it then is quite often, if again, I think a bit of education about how to use it there is still needed, but you know, you're giving the model more information, potentially like an article that you've read or something, and you're asking it to help you summarize it, asking it to help summarize it in a different way, or like, you know, there's things where people will put in a prompt that gets it to explain it in a more like entertaining way, but just so that they have more attention there. I myself have ADHD, and that feature is really valuable to me because it just makes it something that's more engaging and digestible to me. I think the issues in particular that we're talking about, and you know, is in terms of using it to help you come up with ideas or write papers or even assignments and things like that. Like the things, and it kind of taps in a bit with what David was saying about how important is this assignment. If you learn something that's maybe not quite right, is that as problematic when you then go to your next class and someone can correct that for you? It's not as problematic as when you write your assignment, but you haven't actually written it, you've used AI. And that's when those skills that we're talking about would be necessary. So I think whilst you're waiting for those to develop, you can use it in these other ways and you'll be absolutely fine. You'll still get the benefits of it. And so I think, yeah, my answer to the question is basically how you're using it should vary. And I think that matters for everyone, essentially.
So I'll pick up on the education theme. When I'm not explaining AI, I'm the director of education in the department. And one of the things that we are really struggling with really is student use of AI. It's dissertation marking month, so we've just marked something like 300 dissertations, and there are cases where we're having to discuss, you know, I've seen this in the piece of work, is this okay? We have had, not recently, historically now, for example, reference lists being produced using generative AI, and you think, okay, that's fine, it's just formatting it for me, but actually it's not. It's potentially inventing the references. The citations that it's putting in this list actually don't exist, and there's no excuse for doing that. It is, you know, if you're citing something, you're supposed to have at least read it, and you can't have read it if it's not there. So I think there's a certain amount of exploration going on from students. They're trying things out, and they're using these things in ways that they don't fully understand because nobody fully understands it, and that's quite a high risk strategy. If you're doing, you know, you're I don't know, maybe working on a problem sheet in week 1 of a module, then you know, you're trying to understand some of the terms, you're putting in, getting a bit more explanation of what you're being taught. That's certainly one thing. If you put it into, I say, a 60 credit dissertation, and that's doing a heavy load of the work, it's doing the work and you're not. The trick is that you're supposed to be doing the work, and it's a high risk strategy to get caught out on, if you're doing a master's course, that's a third of your degree gone. So I think it's a really hard one for us to advise on at the moment. We're understanding it, more and more each day by day. But I think I would really advise that people are trying to be careful with what they're doing. And if you're not sure about something, then ask. Get an opinion from someone who's supervising you or an academic in your department. We'll probably not have the answer immediately, but we'll discuss it and let you know. And we're all learning how to do this at the same time. So there are no stupid questions. I don't know, there might be, but probably not.
Yeah.
So I'd like to try to, the original question was something like whether it will stunt our growth or it will provide some sort of opportunity for increased excellence and growth, right? And I think the answer is just that it does both, right? By using tools that take some of the work off us, it definitely does both. And so we just need to be very careful about how that happens. So that's a little bit of what David said. Like, there are certain features of what you're doing where you really just oughtn't use it at all, like in the generation of a reference list. Like, the reference list isn't just a piece of formatting on a document. It's supposed to be evidence of your scholarship. And Olivia mentioned some cases about, well, how significant is the mistake going to be if it can be corrected later? And I think that's quite valid and right as well. But I think another thing to point out is the difference between just acquiring skills and acquiring knowledge. So I keep coming back to handwriting because I think it's an important case, and it's one where, like, within some of our lifetimes more than other of our lifetimes, that we can actually see changes and differences. But I challenge you to look at the handwriting of someone who learned proper handwriting when they were young, or who forced themselves to do it, regardless of whether they were taught so in school, compared to the handwriting of someone who didn't. And it's just radically different, right? And the people who learn proper handwriting when they're young are able to continue to do proper handwriting and to improve their handwriting over time. Whereas people who try to just improve it later on in life don't necessarily improve as much. And that's something I currently struggle with myself. And I just have deep worries that that will happen with the nature of conceptualization of a project. Conceptualization of a project, such as a research project or a paper, an essay or something, is something that's a skill. It requires a lot of refinement and fine control and tuning of your concepts over time. And if you're getting some machine to do that fine controlled tuning for you over time, you're simply not learning that skill, and you're putting yourself at a significant risk of a deficit later on.
Agreed, yeah. And to kind of pivot towards looking at AI kind of agency, as models surpass human qualities and possess kind of human associated characteristics, should we be concerned about potential consciousness of models and experiences of the models themselves?
Open the very controversial debate within psychology. It's always been there, and I think it will always stay there. This idea of like what consciousness is, what is it that makes us conscious compared to other species? And I actually think that that's kind of relevant to this debate as well, as this idea of the fact that we quite often see ourselves as like the superior species, so then we think that like nothing else is capable of it. And I think that's where this does get very complicated. What is it that we actually attribute with consciousness? Could it then potentially reach that definition? But I think what is potentially consistent across people, that if we just accept that maybe something like consciousness exists, even if it's not, somewhat universal in exactly how it's defined. I think if we think about again how AI is made, it doesn't actually have an understanding behind a series of numbers. And so even if we were to be, again, I'm not going to talk too much on the tech side, but I'm just saying that my understanding, it's just, it's binary numbers. And so even if we were able to put in like morality into the model, for example, it's able to do things in a way that mirrors it, but it still doesn't have much more understanding beyond that kind of numerical kind of 0 to 1 order or whatever it might be. So I think in that sense, no, basically, and I don't think it ever potentially would. But again, I think it comes down to like how do we define it? Like, doesn't matter if it's not technically consciousness, but it's very good at imitating something like that. And even now, like, we see a lot of people kind of overusing AI for things like literally therapy, because it does kind of simulate what we feel as consciousness in sentient beings. So I think, yeah, it's controversial to say the least, but hopefully there was something consistent there.
I'll say a bit about this. I teach the Ethics of Emerging Technology course in our philosophy department here, so if you'd like to hear more, come take my class. But I think one thing to note is that the debate kind of gets stuck on whether or not AI can have human level consciousness of the same self-reflective, highly sort of feeling oriented kind that we have. Like, will it have all of the same sensory modalities as us? Will it experience self-reflection? And I think that's kind of not a great place for the debate to get stalled. A better analysis would be to look at something like the diversity of kinds of minds that exist in nature. And different types of minds, like different animal minds, for instance, have fundamentally different ways that they approach sense data and probably have different ways that they approach self-reflection. Frogs, for instance, seem to lack a corpus callosum and so have two halves of their brain acting independently, where sometimes the left side is not aware of what the right side is doing. Insects, it seems to be even worse. So there's a general question about whether or not we could sort of simulate a human mind in a machine, and I think that debate is sort of stalled. It's just a technical question of how much you can actually pack into the machine, and we just don't know yet. But a better question to ask about the models that are coming out is whether or not we should think about them more like animal minds and how much like a human mind they are.
To whiz through 3 more questions before we get onto the Q&A. In the case of kind of an AGI or an ASI, how do we ensure that it remains morally aligned?
One thing we can do is ask people. I'm a reasonably big fan of asking people, what do you think of this? Is this right? And there are, if you build any sort of explainability tool, really, you need to do some sort of usability study. So I guess I'm proposing a usability study on a grand scale, tying it into AGI and all of morality. How hard could that be?
I suppose I want to say, how do you make a human morally aligned? And the answer is, well, we've got all kinds of things that fall under moral education and moral psychology, but most of them don't work, at least some of the time. So we just have to accept that if we are going to produce machines like this, that very often we'll fail at making them morally aligned.
Yeah, I think to kind of tap into that, it's one of the most challenging things in this area is what the distinction between explicit morality and implicit morality. The difference there being like basically your awareness of those two things. And essentially, whenever you ask someone anything, we have this issue in like every area of psychology, and you get them to think about it, we end up with a lot of inconsistency. And the reason being is that as we get to that level of awareness, we're engaging more like complex thinking. And so we're incorporating things like that have impacted us, such as our culture, things our parents have taught us, so on and so forth. There's less consistency there. And so then quite often you end up with very mixed kind of judgments as to whether something is morally okay or not. Whereas if you look at something on the implicit level, which is more the stuff that I'm doing at the moment, you do get more consistency, but then you kind of get to a point where it's like, okay, but if people aren't explicitly agreeing with that, is that potentially problematic as well? And there's also like there's a limit that we get to with the implicit thinking before we then actually can't explain anything else. What I mean by that is that this implicit understanding of morality, which happens outside of the awareness, we don't really use that often in the real world. So it's just a way to get that understanding. But again, like in reality, we are engaging that like higher order thinking. We are using culture and things like that as well. So it always ends up quite kind of murky, because what are we aligning it with? What framework are we aligning it with? And that's what's so controversial in the field, even at the moment, is like, is it possible to even use some kind of benchmark, especially if it's explicit? Basically, like, what do we define as morally aligned? And actually, I think it links quite a lot with what I was mentioning earlier about the people creating it. Someone has to make that decision that that's the framework, and that in itself has its own problems.
Yeah, and I remember we kind of touched on this as well in terms of should the benchmark be based on human kind of moral ethics as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that last point that Olivia made there, if I could. So I think one of the things that often gets neglected in the alignment debate is just how would we pick some arbitrary fixed set of morals that we consider to be good and then impose them on some machine? And in part, that's a technical question, and in part, it's not. I mean, in part, it is a question about what it means for a machine to either implicitly or explicitly follow a set of rules. They're guaranteed to be quite good at explicitly following sets of explicit rules. But I think the bigger question is just how we decide what those things are in the first place. I mean, there just isn't such a thing as human values. I mean, every value that you can find, we can find human beings that don't have that value. And what somebody considers to be a good form of AI-aligned technology, I would consider to be a Marxist-Leninist moral machine, right? So there's a bigger question. It's just a general ethical question about who should have the power to imbue machines with ethics in the first place.
We're going to do one last question before we do a close-off question. I know that you have to head off as well, Tyler. But on the flip side of AI over-reliance, what do you think will be the implication of the AI adoption gap in terms of how will this affect people who opt not to integrate AI into work and their lives, especially young people?
I guess at some level they'll be disadvantaged because AI will become so prevalent, or is becoming so prevalent now, that it will be a base expectation that people engage with it. So a good analog for this would be smartphones, and the number of people who no longer have a smartphone is rapidly decreasing. I would guess the number of people on this call who don't have a smartphone is probably less than 5 or 6, and that's partly based on the demographic and age of people likely to be on this call. The people who are less likely to have a smartphone and the people who are older, who haven't grown up with them. And there are things, two-factor authentication, for example, which many of us now take for granted. And people who don't have a smartphone to do that with they struggle. There was a friend of mine who was talking about their gym now requires them to use an app to get into their gym, and they have to go and talk to a person at a desk who has to go through a convoluted procedure to let them into the gym now because they don't have a smartphone and they have no intention of getting one. AI will be the same, I predict, and I think one of the things we need to get much better at here as an academic institution is teaching people how to use AI. And we're doing, Tyler got a plug-in for a module earlier on, so I'll do the same. We have a prompt engineering module in our second year that is open to anyone in the university who wants to come and learn some prompt engineering. What is it? How does it work? How can you do it safely and so on, and ethically? And I think it will become a differentiator in the job market. If you're able to use AI versus someone who isn't, then you're going to have a leg up in your career. So yeah, I think that's definitely going to disadvantage people. What I don't think is that that's fair or right or whatever, but I think it's it's just what it is now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also what Dave was kind of talking about was like being trained on this piece of technology as well, because I think for both AI and also, like, if we use David's smartphone example, my mum has a smartphone, but if you asked her to try and get into the gym with it, different story. So she ends up just as disadvantaged despite the fact that she has the smartphone. And so very similar with AI as well. If you're not actually trained on how to use it properly, you're just as disadvantaged. Like the same kind of students that we've been talking about, that where we've seen them use AI and not actually creating their own references and things like that. I think even like Tyler spoke about this as well, you're not learning the skills. So then when you go to try and apply for jobs later, you're not actually able to apply those skills because they're not your skills, they're AI skills. And you never actually demonstrated your own ability for that. So I think, as much as not having it is a disadvantage, also not being able to use it properly would be a massive, potentially a bigger disadvantage, I think, in comparison.
And to close off, what are your thoughts on a future web that is completely AI run? Here I'm kind of referencing the dead internet theory, where the internet will basically be consisted of bot generated content that is manipulated by or curated by the algorithm.
I have a view about this, which is mere speculation. But one of the things that I think universities may start doing is offering what we might call classical education, where many other institutions will be focusing on producing large amounts of people able to interact with the world largely run by AI. There'll be some small contingent of people who want a naturalistic or natural or classical education. That's just a hope that there is still some room for revolt in a world that's largely dominated by AI, but I think it's plausible.
Yeah, I think with this idea of, I don't know much about this, but this idea of a website being basically entirely AI, I think it would be kind of disappointing to see in a way, because a lot of the things that we are learning throughout academia, students are learning is, how you get like the highest marks in an essay is to basically contribute your opinion in a way, in a empirically supported way. And if you basically have AI's response of what it deems to be most valuable, then you take that away, because there's a wealth of literature out there, and everyone would kind of take something slightly differently away from that. And that's how we end up with advancements, is because people will interpret things a bit differently and go, oh, but what about this? And so I think if you have the same model behind this as well, then you don't allow that kind of differentiation that you get. And I think that's what's so valuable to human contribution, is that we do all think differently. And I think that kind of takes that away by just giving what would essentially be a fairly consistent response across people, unless they use a different prompt.
I agree. I think it sounds utterly ghastly, to be honest. I think then I've got a very varied job. I do lots of different things, but in any given week, the high point is usually an interaction with a person and talking about an idea and getting their perspective on it and hearing what they think. And all three of us in our answers here have used the word think. And I think that's really important. The AI is not thinking. Something that I've trained myself to do is to stop referring to it with inappropriate pronouns. So I used to, when I was teaching AI courses, I would start to inadvertently say they or I say, oh, he's done this or she's done that. And it's just, so one of the very early AIs was called Eliza, and it was actually a therapist. It was built in the 1960s, and it was utterly horrifying in terms of how it responded. It basically tells you to sort yourself out, which is not helpful. And it's very easy to start personifying it and anthropomorphizing it. And I think we have to be very clear that it's not a person at this point. It's not conscious. Whether or not it will be in the future, it's not now. And I think we need to talk to people. We had a whole year where we stayed in our houses and didn't talk to people. And I think let's enjoy being able to and not rely on it more than we have to, and use it for the things that it's good at.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today on this panel. It's been extremely interesting. We'll move on to the Q&A session. Yeah.
I'm very sorry, but I have to leave a little bit early, so I can't join the Q&A session. But it was very nice to be here and nice to meet the other panelists. It was great.
Thank you so much for your time, Tyler. Bye. Yeah, so I'll start with the first question. We had a question about the environmental impacts of AI, particularly large language models. It is often said that AI can benefit the environment, E.G., through better climate predictions or optimizing responses, and that this could offset the environmental impacts of AI. How do we measure this? What opinions exist for using AI more sustainably?
So there are a plethora of ways that you can use AI for the benefit of the environment. So, for example, I've done some work in optimizing the design of offshore renewable energy farms so that you produce more energy that's green. You therefore reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, and the environment gets better. The flip side, as you say, is whenever you're doing any computation at all, you're using electricity. And in order to run large language models, you need a massive amount of electricity. The data centers that run these things are, massively power hungry. So there is definitely a trade-off between the two. What people in the field, I went to some talks this week actually, people in the field are looking at designing models that simultaneously optimize the good that you do to the environment by having the thing working in the first place, but also minimizing the cost. So it might be that you can use a smaller model, or you can use smaller numbers of training runs, or you can use perhaps instrument your or fit out your data center with green energy. There are things people are looking at doing to try and mitigate the harm. But it is not the case that just using the AI is going to make the environment better. There's a cost with any of these things.
Yeah, and I think that the smallest addition I'm going to add to that is just that I think it can be quite easy in these kind of discussions to talk about, broader issues that we don't really feel like we have any ability to kind of action anything from. And so I think, like, for all of us here, the one thing that we can do, I guess I'm also selling David Walker's course as well. But I think prompt engineering is like really important, because when people don't know how to use it, the answers that they get aren't exactly what they were after, and so then they send more prompts or like more messages and everything, and that is contributing. I think I'd seen this statistic about like every message or something you send to ChatGPT is like equivalent to like 1 bottle of water. So if you think about every time you're following that up, like the number of bottles you're getting through, I'm sure I've misunderstood that, because that seems genuinely insane. But if it is something like that, then you can see how learning prompt engineering would be so crucial to help reduce that impact, and hopefully just send like one prompt and get exactly what you need back. And that's how we can help to reduce the environmental impact of that.
We're going to circle back to the reflection that we kind of had at the beginning of the presentation, whilst we wait for some questions to come in through the chat. And I'd like to get to know you guys' opinions on the panel about whether AI is a net positive for society.
I can go. I think.
Sorry, I coughed over for the panel, but you go.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Is AI a net good for society? You've hit us with really small, trivial questions this afternoon. I think it has to be. I have to believe it has to be, because I've spent 15 years working on it. I think there are applications within, for example, the health service, and I'm not thinking about, when you think about using AI in the health service, you often think about medical imaging, for example. I'm talking about scheduling porters to make sure they're in the right place at the right time and they're being efficient. I'm talking about minimizing waste. I'm talking about, most of my work is around optimization. So lots of the examples are around driving a KPI up or down. But I think there are many ways. We're in a situation where society is struggling financially. The public purse is not as big as it could be or has been in the past, or people would like it to be. So I think one thing that we can do is to look for ways to be efficient without necessarily just cutting things and stopping things. And these problems are, if you think about scheduling 50 hospital porters within the RD&E, that's not a scheduling task that a human can easily undertake, because there are too many variables. So these are smallish conceptually problems that AI is really good at. And there are ways there, I think, people get very keen on LLMs. LLMs are only, where are we, 2025? They're about 3 years old in their popular usage. They're older than that, but they are, they came out in late 2022. I think the AI, the broader term of AI, it has lots of potential to benefit society. I think we've got to be careful how we use it, though. So it's always the yes but answer in this case. We've got to be sure that we're using it ethically, We've got to be sure that we're not burning up lakes to, generate crossword puzzles and things using generative AI. We've got to be sure that we're not adversely affecting people who are going to be, so one of the horrifying uses of AI is within the criminal justice system. There's a tool in the United States called Compass, which is trained on historical criminal activity, and the prosecutions and the likelihood of people reoffending and that sort of thing. And in the United States, it's well known that there is a very strong bias towards certain people, and therefore, surprise, surprise, the system that's trained on that data basically discriminates against those people. And this is not how we should be using it. We could use it really brilliantly, I think. So yes, with a very long but, I think is how I'll summarize.
I think I would answer
Thank
in
you.
the same way, essentially. And I think the key thing of what David said was how it's used as well. I think, yes, it has potential. I don't think it currently is really taking advantage of that potential. It does have potential, but I think especially with how AI is currently being kind of expanded, it's essentially just by a lot of companies. So they're not really going to care that much about like whether it's ethical, whether it does all of the things that we've basically spoken about, because if it's not equaling financial output, then it's not really going to matter. And I think that's where these problems become quite a concern for all of us, because it's not the forefront. And I think that's where it does just at the moment to me as well, like seem like it's just a potential for positive use, but not currently and seemingly not in the future either.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to hand over to Lorenzo. He has a sentence or two about the checking code, and then we'll try and whiz through some questions. They have all come through at the same time, it seems.
Yes, so just a couple points, important points. So first of all, it's going to be here on the screen. You're going to be able to see a check-in code. This check-in code is what you can use to check in for the session, what will be used to track your attendance. We sincerely hope, if you can put the check-in code, thank you. Perfect. Sincerely hope that you enjoy this session. The way it works is you just take the code, you go into the platform session 1, you copy paste it, click on, and then we'll have one session ready from 1 to 5, 3 specific questions, and then an open note. If you put any note there, any reflection, any feedback, it will be used directly to improve our next 2 sessions. So spend a couple, maybe now we're going to leave 1 or 2 minutes to do that. Another important point is that the way we've designed this course is to go from the most theoretical to the more practical. So this was a bit of this session a bit to put the foundation, theoretical foundations and reflections and sparkle a bit of ideas in the audience as well. And we hope we achieve that. And the next 2 sessions are going to go more and more practical. So the key things we're going to talk on the next session are going to be about prompt engineering. So how to effectively interact with an LLM and how to have a better output. We're also going to talk about AI agents, which we're going to obviously to introduce, which are tools and ways to have a better output from AI. And finally, we're also having 2 external speakers that will talk about their experience as entrepreneur, or also as innovators, or just using AI to land jobs and further their career. I hope you're all able to check in. If you're not, no worries. Just send us a message and we'll check in for you manually. We're going to leave maybe now 1 minute for everyone to check in, and then we're going to go to the Q&A up to basically till the question are finished, or maybe a bit longer than 3:30.
If I leave a little bit less than 1 minute, just for the sake of time, and I will start asking some of these questions. So the first one that we have here is, am I right in thinking there is only knowledge available about how a global legal framework will encompass the ethical considerations associated with the effect AI might have on human learning over time?
Wait, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
No, of course. Am I right in thinking that there is only limited knowledge available about how a global legal framework will encompass ethical considerations associated with the effect AI might have on human learning?
I mean, it's not in my area of expertise. I think, from my understanding, the extent of it in terms of like legislations is, I don't even know if the UK really has much itself. I know during the Biden administration there was something put into place, I believe, but I think it's just more, it's not really applicable so much to human learning, and I'm not sure if there is anything here either. But yeah, I could be wrong. I know each university have their own kind of set of guidelines. I think that may kind of pinpoint to that in itself, I guess.
And how does the use of AI affect human interaction, considering the use of LLMs to ask for advice, opinions, or even for replacing some types of psychological therapy?
I think, I mean, we kind of spoke a bit about this, David especially. I think it's already quite sad to see like how people are kind of relying on it instead of human communication. Like I've seen people use it to automate email responses and stuff, so people aren't even communicating that way with each other. And we already kind of lose that a lot anyway by using technology a lot with emails or even like online video calls and stuff. But I think the issue in particular with like, if we talk about like the psychology aspect in terms of like therapy and so on and so forth, the models aren't actually trained as therapists. that you know, they've just essentially got like the right kind of way. They just have like an ability to an extent of kind of simulating an understanding person. So I that's kind of the extent, is just having like a listening ear, really. And there's not really necessarily like skills in place, or it's not giving necessarily like skills that you would potentially get from a therapist. And I think it could be, especially for people that genuinely need it, I think it could be quite damaging for that to be the extent of you know their mental health service. And I think obviously if we think about the current situation, getting access to mental health services is really, really difficult. So in the meantime, okay, yes, we've got something, but I think there's kind of like two things that I'd be concerned about, is that people just using that and then not going out for something afterwards when it does become available if they need that. But also secondly, potentially like even the government overusing it and thinking that this is like a good, you know, essentially putting more funding into an AI model than healthcare workers, for example. I'm not saying they would do that, but you can kind of imagine like if that's going to save the government a lot of money, then that would be an appealing thing. So I think it's, yeah, as we were kind of discussing, like it's only got a certain capacity to kind of simulate this understanding, and I don't think we should over rely on it at all, especially in cases like this.
I completely agree. So a large language model, so the basic function of an LLM is to simulate what the answer to a question could be. It's not even answering the question. It's saying, you know, if I say, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Then it will think, okay, so this person's asking about dinner. Probably they want to know what they're having for dinner. Let's maybe try and get something that looks like an answer that the person might expect. And because they're as good as they are, it looks like an answer. So we're fooled into thinking, okay, it's giving me a categorical instruction that I must have fish and chips tonight, and it's not doing that at all. And I think, you know, if I'm asking it what I should eat, as I said earlier on, then there's nothing particularly lost. I might have a dodgy meal, but I'm alive at the end of it. If the if I'm using it in a healthcare scenario, I mean, particularly, I guess, a mental health scenario, I could end up getting and acting on some really bad advice. And people, I mean, really just mustn't do it. I think is my position on it. I'm a bit of a hardliner when it comes to this.
Definitely. And the next question is, in the context of healthcare, we are seeing tools emerge about being able to, let me read that again, sorry. In the context of healthcare, we are seeing tools emerge to do things like predict cancer far before other methods can detect it. this is obviously very expensive to implement. Do you think it will ever be economically viable to distribute this technology on a wider scale so it becomes a commonplace procedure? For example, a regular checkup or test like we see for other conditions.
I think I disagree with the premise of the question. I don't think it's the cost that stops this from happening at the moment. I think if we wanted to do this, we could easily do it from a technical point of view, from an economic point of view. The risk is with the data. And if you have a scan, that is very personal data. And if you imagine that data is lost, I mean, we have in the recent sort of month, we've had the Co-op, we've had Marks and Spencer, we've had really big names on the British High Street who've been the victim of a cyber attack. And I had an email from M&S and they said, you know, your data was involved in this loss, but it's okay because they only know where you live. And that's just my name and address. Imagine if it was something that revealed I had some sort of medical condition that then gets fed into some sort of insurance machine and I can't get insurance. You know, it has real life altering effects. So I think an issue at the moment is the data privacy. I don't think the cost is particularly prohibitive. Once you've trained the model, you know, it can be deployed, and we have models that are better than consultants for detecting tumors, for example. The thing that I think is most important with this, though, is we don't use them for decision making. We should use them for triaging cases, and that's going to mean that all cases are looked at, but we're prioritizing the most severe cases, and they're looked at first. But that doesn't mean that someone who's further down the likelihood of having cancer doesn't get their scan checked by a human doctor. That's critical, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I would also just quickly say as well, I think again, it taps into how the algorithm was made, you know, where we got the data from and so on. If we go back to what I was saying earlier with like marginalized groups, if you have, you know, a minority group that are, you know, less likely to even receive screening in the first place, and therefore maybe are like underrepresented in the data that this model's been trained on, then if the model's been trained to basically just come to any kind of solution to figure out whether this person's at risk or not, then it could also be using information like, for example, if people of color are underrepresented in this data, then according to this model, people of color are less likely to get cancer, for example. This is a crazy example, but I'm just saying like that this is potentially how this kind of technology could be misused, is that the AI, because it doesn't actually have an understanding, basically misinterpreting lack of data towards certain minority groups as meaning that they're less likely to get that kind of illness, when it's actually just that they weren't receiving equitable care in the first place.
The next question is from Abram. Is there only limited understanding on how global legal framework handles the ethics impact on AI learning? Who decides how and when AI should be used in education, and should its use be limited to certain areas like research? If AI becomes unreliable or even gets banned, what happens to people who've come to depend on it for learning and thinking? So maybe let's start with who decides how AI is used in education.
I think this comes back to we don't know. I think it's the responsibility at the moment of people who are designing work to make sure that it is. I think there are two things. You need to have confidence that the skills, the subject specific skills that you're testing are there. But you also need to make sure that you're preparing work ready graduates. So making sure that skills such as using AI are included. So I think we need to be confident that we have assessments designed that are testing the right academic and subject specific skills, but that also are preparing students for work by using AI in certain aspects of it. And that I think has to currently be down to the people who are designing the courses and the assessments. I think I've answered a very limited part of the question. I think we're learning how to do this, and I think in places we're not particularly good at it. I usually mark an assessment and think, that's got an AI hole in it that someone could use ChatGPT to do. And I'll plug that one, and next time there'll be something else. It's adapting so fast that in some ways we can't keep up with it. But I think we need to get much better at using it, and I don't think we're there yet. Sorry, I think that was probably quite a poor answer to the question.
No, it was great. Olivia, do you have anything to add, or shall I move on?
I guess just like the latter part of that question was like, if it then gets banned, how do you deal with, students that have been dependent on it? I think don't be dependent on it in the first place. I think kind of like, as we've been talking about this whole time, you're even now, like whether it gets banned or not, you're doing yourself a disservice if you become over reliant on this tool. It's not a very good tool at the moment, as we've said, but even just generally, like you're taking away your own ability to learn those skills. So like, don't make yourself essentially limited by the existence of a tool. Anything kind of external, I think, like I think, kind of embrace the qualities that you have that AI doesn't. And that's also what you would then also have if AI starts, making jobs redundant, which is another fear that people have. That wouldn't be as much of a fear because you now know what you have to offer that AI doesn't.
Definitely. And to continue on this theme of academics, Kios is asking, if one does use AI for their work, is their work devalued when they declare this collaboration? Is it fair that some people will declare the collaboration and some don't? And how will we deal with that?
So I can say just from it, marking myself, we don't really, the contribution statements, like we don't really use that necessarily to mark you down, at least in our area. What I will say though is that if you've misused it, it will be reflected in your grade anyway, because the content won't be relevant enough. I mean, kind of like as David was saying earlier, but like it doesn't really answer your question when you put the prompt in. That's what it does when you put in your essay question and then copy and paste the essay. Like we can see that it's not a human that's written it, because it's just like saying a lot but saying nothing at the same time is like generally what the consistent thing is. So I think in any sense of the usage, if you are misusing it, it will reflect in your grade anyway. And I think kind of like what we've been saying is that if you're using it in the right way, then there's kind of like fine, like we were saying about being disadvantaged if you're not using it at all. I think we're all coming to the point where we're recognizing that it is a tool that people are using. People will continue to use it. I think it would be wrong as an education system to, restrict people's use of it. But yeah, again, as I say, like if you're not using it correctly at all, that it will be clear.
I think it's the depth as well. So in my last job at another university, I was asked by our head of school to write a strategy for our department, and he said, "Do not use ChatGPT to do this." So as a joke, I put it into ChatGPT. I'm at the University of X. I'm running a computer science department. Give me a strategy for the next 5 years that will make us excellent or whatever. And it came back and it said, in various degrees of depth, and I prodded it for more detail repeatedly, that we should be doing good education, we should be doing good research, and we should be having a positive impact on society. And I went away from the conversation having burned up a late to find this, startling insight out, but thinking, I knew all that. What I wanted was actual insight. At various points, it pointed me towards the university website and said, have a look at that if you want more information. None of this is useful. If you ask it to write an essay for you, it will do the same thing. You'll get very poor levels of depth. And certainly the further you get through your university career towards, if you're doing a master's where you're being really assessed on your critical analysis skills, you'll just get bad marks. And it's not so much, there's the will I get caught for doing this? You just won't do very well. And I think people are more reliably starting to understand that and starting to restrict their use. And I think we have the same problem with those declarations. But it's interesting to see over the course of the year we've been using them that they're becoming more targeted, and people are saying, I've used this for proofreading. They're not using, at the start of the year, they were taking everything, and it was just not realistic. But people are starting to know what they can do with it.
Yeah. We have a question saying, what's your take on AI hardware? Do you think it's important for us to grasp this area? I feel like we're putting a lot of emphasis on developing our AI skills, but I really believe that understanding how AI works from the ground up is crucial. By doing this, those skills will become more achievable and less easier to grasp. Or am I feeling a bit overwhelmed?
Possibly. It depends, I think, what you want to do. If you want to go out and have a career in any discipline, use AI as a tool in that discipline and get on in your career and with your life, etc. I don't think you need to have a deep understanding of AI hardware. I don't have a massively deep understanding of AI hardware, and I work in the field. I think the people that need to understand AI hardware are the people who are developing it and using it. And unless you're doing that, then I don't think it's something I would be much more focused on what you're using it for, how you're using it, and how you can get the most out of it for what you need to use it for. It's a fascinating subject area, though. So if it's something you want to look into more, I will not dissuade you.
Yeah, I agree. I think really like the extent of your knowledge that might be helpful is just understanding a little bit about, like David said at the very beginning, talking about like black box models and things like that, just so you have like a little bit more of an idea of in terms of like transparency. And I think just having, we've kind of discussed a lot about how it can't really understand what it's actually producing, and it's just giving like a kind of quote unquote like educated guess as to like what would be a suitable answer. And so I think just having like a very, very, very basic understanding of how it kind of is constructed in that sense can help you understand, like grasp those points more. That's essentially the extent of my knowledge in a lot of cases, which comes from like a lot of courses like this, where it's just like a very early on kind of introduction to AI. And that's enough for you to then kind of make your own judgment to the answer of like all these other questions, I think.
Mm-hmm. And to finish, because we're running a little bit over time, the next question is from Megan. She raises concerns about how AI can be safely and fairly used in healthcare, given its reliance on data input and lack of human clinical judgment. How can AI be trusted to make accurate, unbiased medical decisions when input varies between professionals and patients' biology differs so widely? And if AI is used in diagnosis or treatment, who is ultimately responsible for the outcome, and what safety measures should be in place to protect patients?
So two things. The first thing is when you build a model, there is a thing called overfitting, which is basically the idea that the model is trained so much on the training data it's exposed to, that what you eventually end up with is a very good predictor for that particular data set. And if you give it something new, then it can't generalize to it at all. So we have various techniques that are built into the training process that are designed to try and make it generalize. So the hope, which is reassuring in the medical context, is that the model is trained properly and doesn't have that sort of overfit to a specific person or a specific group of people. That's not to say that it's not, but it shouldn't be. The other thing, in terms of oversight, I think comes back to the point I made earlier on about using this for decision support and not decision making. So this should be used, I firmly believe in a medical context, this should be used for triage and for helping clinicians come to a proper decision about someone's treatment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was going to say the same thing. Essentially, just like the extent should be collaboration, support, never much further than that, especially in like these kind of contexts where the risks are higher.
Megan, do you have something to say? I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, hi. It's just it doesn't really capture the sort of the question that was asked because there was a few in there. So it's just more about the fact if you think about the biopsychosocial model, everybody is different, even though we all are very similar. There are nuances between us, and I'm curious as to how AI is going to be able to differentiate between those nuances, because that's why one drug will work for one person, it won't work for another. And if we are saying that AI is quite generalized to a degree, I'm just curious as to how AI is going to be able to do that, or how it is doing that, not doing that. And then again, the safety aspect that comes into it. That's all. Thank you.
So I think the idea of generalization is not just so that you look at the entire population of the world and say let's just use the same model for each people. There are techniques whereby you, for example, use different models for different groups of data. So you might use it for, I don't know, you might have it if you're talking about drug effect, you might have different sorts of drugs for people with different sorts of models, sorry, for people with different sorts of medical histories. In terms of the safety aspect, I think a lot of it does have to rely on human oversight. There's also a technical component to it as well, which is people are working on robust and verifiable AI, which is the idea that it can be formally verified, so you know basically exactly what it will do under any circumstances. Software has been put through this sort of process for decades, and now people are looking at how do we do this with AI. The trick is that it's based on probabilistic models, so we can't be as sure how it's going to work, so new techniques are needed. I hope that's answered your question a little bit better than the first go.
I can add a little bit to it as well. I think, like David was saying, first of all, you have different models that are kind of specialized towards different situations. But I think even if we think about how research works, the idea is we're trying to get a more generalized understanding first that applies to the majority of people. So like even when we're trying to understand how, moral cognition works, or if we think about drugs for depression, for example, we have a drug that helps the majority of the population. And now a lot of the research focus, especially in like psychopharmacology, is on people with treatment-resistant depression. So it's like once we're able to kind of deal and essentially like help as many people as possible, we can then, with that understanding as well, because it's important to have that base understanding to then understand how those nuances do differ, because then we can understand why a bit better as well, because we can see what's different between this majority population and then these individuals that aren't responding like the majority. So we have to have the main bit first, then we can kind of focus on the smaller groups, and then that kind of helps us to like actually capture those nuances a bit. If that helps. And I think like in some cases that's why these like specialized models help, and that's why what I was just talking about helps as well. In some cases, like some nuances are going to be less relevant to that context, and so you don't want the kind of flip side of well, actually quite a similar issue with like overfitting. You don't want it to be a situation where like it's essentially never able to find an answer because it can't deal with all of those different nuances.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's a great place to finish off. There is extensive kind of areas that we obviously weren't able to cover within this section, unfortunately, but that will definitely be something that we consider and look to in the future. So thank you so much for coming to our session today, and a special thank you to our panelists as well. And if anyone has any further questions, feel free to email us and we will make sure that we hopefully provide you an insightful answer. Thank you so much.
See you all on Thursday.
Thank you very much for organising the event. Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone.
Thank you guys. See you on Thursday next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye guys.